I want to reiterate the point that Deputy Gannon has made, that the actions we're looking for on foot of this motion are exceptionally modest as part of the new decade, new agreement in Northern Ireland. And we do remember that very well. That was in January. I'm sure you remember that, Minister, in January, just before the general election was called, where the institutions were, got back up and running, and the agreement was signed up to by the previous government as a co-guarantor of the Good Friday Agreement. So the last government committed to focus on creating good jobs and protecting workers' rights. This motion is calling on the government to demonstrate the same commitment to workers' rights in the Republic as we're signed up to in the North. Yesterday, the Taoiseach said to me during Minister's questions that essentially there isn't a crystal ball, and it's to see how long COVID, the pandemic, will go on for, or its long-term effects. And of course that's true. But while we may not be able to see the future, we shouldn't allow ourselves to forget the very recent past. And we need to be aiming to recover in a way that we've learned lessons from the past, because there were obvious structural weaknesses in the way work has been developing in a precarious way, where people can't make decisions for themselves because they're never sure of their income. The COVID crisis has had a devastating impact on public health and the wider economy at large. The ongoing pandemic has amplified and shone a light on the many issues affecting workers in this country. Throughout this pandemic, every single member of this House has paid particular praise to workers, and particularly low-paid and precarious workers, the people who delivered the food to our supermarkets, who stocked the shelves, who we met at the checkouts. People refocused what they saw as being essential. But it can't be enough just to acknowledge that and to thank people and congratulate them. The fact is that those workers can't live on our platitudes. We owe them a debt of gratitude, and we need to deliver real practical solutions to vindicate their rights. That has to be the legacy from this crisis. When this COVID-19 crisis passes, employers, both in the private and public sectors, will be judged on how they've treated the most vulnerable workers during these unprecedented times. But this Dáil has an equal responsibility to ensure that workers' rights and conditions are enshrined in law and have full statutory backing. The latest OECD statistics show that 23% of the Irish workforce are on low paid, and that's the third highest in the European Union. Moreover, a 2018 task report found that 44% of the workforce were in precarious employment, most of whom were at an increased risk of poverty, and they have no guarantee of hours of income, no sick pay, no annual leave and no pension entitlements. And we saw a report just published today in relation to the pension time bomb. And I just wonder to what extent the precarious nature of employment has been built into that. This is bad enough and in and of itself, but if you consider its knock-on effects that it has on workers' lives, how they, don't have the security to, for example, to aspire to maybe buying a house, very often postponing things like forming a family, and even where there is somebody in a good paid job that's contractual employment, very often something like a mortgage is out of reach. So it is not just impacting on their weekly wage and their conditions, but it's impacting on their quality of life and the choices that they can make. In a country as wealthy as ours, this is completely an unacceptable situation. Moreover, it is a non-economic one. At the end of last year, 108,400 part-time workers were categorised as underemployed. According to Eurostat projections, the chances of an Irish part-time worker transition to full-time employment in 2017 was as low as 3%, the lowest in the EU countries that were surveyed. This is a huge resource skill, talents and human potential which we are allowing to be wasted because we remain wedded to an out-of-date, outmoulded model of employment that, quite frankly, belonged to the middle of the last century. It was not fit for purpose before the pandemic, and it's certainly not fit for purpose afterwards. Until we take decisive action, and it won't happen by accident, we are going to see continued rates of inequality and, our shameful poverty rates. Like 1 in 5 children live in poverty. The 1 in 6 members of our people that are employed live below the poverty line. So none of that is acceptable. And yet the government has proposed an amendment to our motion that strips it out of all the practical actions that need to be taken that actually will make a difference. It's particularly telling that their amendment removes all references to workers' rights and collective bargaining. As you know, this is an area which we are distinctly lacking. We're the only Western European Union member state who does not have a binding collective bargaining legislation. So it's particularly troubling to see the government take this tack, especially, as we're seeing the erosion of workers' rights, and obviously we need to rebuild differently. In the last few weeks, I've received a number of messages from workers who are finding themselves under pressure to reduce their pay and conditions to facilitate their employers. As it stands, it's really a David and Goliath fight. And we've seen that, for example, just even outside today with the Debenhams workers. And we can see just how unprotected they are. We saw it a few weeks ago with CityJet, which essentially our examinership process is really working to the advantage of the parent company in the Cayman Islands at the expense of the employees here. And indeed, what we're going to end up here with is a shell company with very little employment. Instant Upright workers were another group. They're seeing their jobs outsourced to China and Latvia. And I think even if you go to one of the shopping malls, you're seeing places not opening and not going to open. And a lot of what has happened will be what was heretofore direct employment here is disappearing, and there needs to be a significant focus on job retention. The workers in this country deserve far greater ambition. We must strive for our country not just to recover from the economic impact of the pandemic, but to recover better than we went into it. We need to see good quality jobs where workers have a voice and a level of autonomy, a guarantee of a decent income, security of tenure, and decent working conditions as the bare minimum every citizen in this country should be entitled to expect. This will require a clear roadmap and legislative plan. The task force we are proposing would be that panacea. Well, it certainly wouldn't be the panacea, but it certainly would. It would lead to at least a focus of attention and moving it in the right direction. We need wide-ranging structural changes, but what we need is a tangible pathway to actually deliver something better, that we don't be here in 2 or 3 years' time talking about the continued precarious nature of work. And indeed, if you start looking at those who are impacted, you'll find that, for example, young people who are talked about as being the group that we need to be most concerned about for the future. They're the ones that are you're most likely to find in the most precarious of jobs. And the reason they will, and it was surveyed quite recently, they're the ones that take up those jobs because they say they don't have any other option. Thank you.